I'm working in Poser Pro 2010 now to show you very briefly another new feature for Poser Pro 2010, which is the network rendering queue. I've set up a scene here. One of the options on the render menu is now rendering queue. And this is a little bit like setting up an image for export, but here I will actually be utilizing other machines in my home network to help me complete the image. As you can see here, there's a set of output settings, including now the progress of the image as it's starting to render. This is a cross-platform option. You can actually install Queue Manager on another Mac or a PC, and then you can use the maximum capacity of your hardware to render your images. I'll go into this in a lot more detail in another section. That image is now rendered, so I can actually go to the folder where it's rendered, and there is the image I just rendered using the Queue Renderer. I've just loaded another scene into Poser Pro 2010 here to show a feature that's also different from Poser 8, which is the ability to be able to render in the background. So I'll come up to the render menu and just click on render in background, and the image will render, but now it's happening in the background, so I can just continue working in Poser, and I can change my camera views if I want and continue working whilst everything's happening in the background. And there's the render ready done. Poser Pro also features a 64-bit rendering engine, which means that it can better utilize the full amount of memory on your 64-bit machine. At the moment I'm running Poser Pro 2010 in 32-bit mode, and you will only get the 64-bit render engine option if you render in the background. But if you run the native 64-bit version of Poser, then you will have the option to render in 64-bit all of the time. And here is an image of Alison produced using the 64-bit render engine. Poser Pro 2010 also now has the option to allow gamma correction on finished output. If I come down to the render settings here, there's the checkbox for gamma correction. The default is 1, but it can be adjusted to whatever value you want, really. This is useful if you're producing high-definition images using linear rendering. Also, you have the option to adjust gamma correction on individual textures. I'll just pop into the material room a second, and I will select one of the objects from the props. And if you know that some of your imported textures do have problems with gamma correction, it can be corrected straight from the Material Manager. Poser Pro 2010 comes in two different flavors now. This is the 32-bit version where the new library tabs and menus are embedded into your main workspace. And here I've launched a native 64-bit version where the library palette is completely separate and floating. I'll just pull it over from my other monitor here. This is due to the fact that the menu is actually Flash-based, and Flash is not supported by a 64-bit program, but luckily Poser has a way of using Adobe Air to make the menu work. In Poser Pro 2010, you also have the option to export high dynamic range images. The option for this is found on the Render Settings dialog box, and I just click the HDRI Optimized Output button here, and then when I come to save the image I've just rendered, one of the options in the export box will be for HDR files and OpenEXR files. That enables you then to get very realistic results in programs such as Photoshop, because you have full control over the details, the shadows, and the high contrast lighting in the image. With Poser Pro, it's also possible to import collada files, which is the industry standard for sharing 3D content between different programs. I'll just select an item here. I'll import the lights and cameras that go with it. As you can see, sometimes the models can be in somewhat different scale to Poser figures, but this can easily be handled. And there is a figure which will probably be suitable for rigging in Poser if it was converted into an object file. And it's also possible to export content from Poser as well into the collada format, with just a few options to click on whilst you're doing that. I'll just save this as Ryan. A few other options which I'll leave as default. And just as a very brief example here, I've exported the Ryan figure into NVIDIA FX Composer 2.5. Poser Pro 2010 can also integrate with other 3D software such as 3D Max, Maya, which is running at the moment, Cinema 4D, and Lightwave. So as a brief view here is a fairly complicated Poser scene, which has been loaded into Maya via the Poser Fusion plugin. If I just change the view, and I'll do a very quick render of this scene. Poser Pro is quite capable of operating with some of the higher-end 3D programs.